later. In 1948, Ernst Wertheimer, who was the pioneer, was a German researcher who fled Germany in 1933, went to Israel. He was a pioneer of the field of fat metabolism. He said, mobilization, deposition of fat go on continually without regard to the nutritional state of the animal. Okay? The classical theory that fat is deposited in the fat tissue only when given in excess of the caloric requirement has been finally disproved. So what we believe today, what all the textbooks and the websites show, was disproven by 1948. So what you have to know basically is there's two forms of fat in the human body. This is Adiposity 101. Triglycerides, which are three fatty acids bound together by a glycerol molecule, and the fatty acids themselves. We store fat as triglycerides. We burn them for fuel as fatty acids. And the reason we do is because triglycerides are too big to enter and exit the fat cell. So that's why we store it as fat. It's like, you know, putting together a piece of furniture that you carry through a room piece by piece, and you build it in the room, and once it's in the room, you can't get it out again. Not that I'm using that metaphor just because I recently moved and had to leave some furniture behind. So fat enters and exits the fat cell as fatty acids, which can slip through the membrane. And so we burn them as fatty acids. We store them as triglycerides. And inside the fat cell, there's this fatty acid triglycerol cycle that's continually cycling in and out. And the pivotal role in this is interesting. It's played by a molecule called glycerol 3-phosphate, which is the activated glycerol. It's a kind of activated glycerol which is used by the cells to bind together the triglycerides. It's produced from glucose when it's metabolized by the cell, and it provides the glycerol molecule, and it determines the rate generally that fatty acids are esterified into triglycerides inside fat cells. So in a sense, it's controlling the rate of fat deposition in the tissue, although in all honesty, whether it's doing it as much as I believed it was when I wrote my book is now in question, because some very smart young biophysicists who read my book went back to the literature that I'd never found and said that both what I'm saying and what the text inside the endocrinology textbooks say may indeed be a bit skewed. But what's interesting about this is that we control the amount of fat because glycerol 3-phosphate is produced from glucose metabolism, and we need glycerol 3-phosphate to store fat in the fat tissue. It's a way that our body uses carbohydrate metabolism to control fat deposition in the same way it uses the release of fat by the fat tissue to control the burning of carbohydrates in the cell. So basically, here's the system where as blood sugar goes up, more glucose goes into the fat tissue. You produce more glycerol 3-phosphate, and here's this triglyceride fatty acid cycle. And so this has a large effect on how much the fatty acids are reesterified into triglycerides, and so contained in the fat tissue, which they could be, or whether or not they're broken down into fatty acids and released from the fat tissue. This is how it's shown in a modern textbook, just to show you that what I'm saying. That last photo was from the 1970s. This is from 2000. But here's glucose entering the cell. It's being metabolized into glycerol 3-phosphate. And here's fatty acids entering, and they're used to esterify the fatty acids of triglyceride. Various places you can get glycerol 3-phosphate from dietary carbohydrates, from glycerol, from creating it anew in the fat tissue, which is another way that may indeed produce some, from recycling the glycerol that's released when fatty acids break down, and from fructose, which is interesting because fructose is what makes both sucrose and high fructose corn syrup sweet. And because you can get so much glycerol 3-phosphate from fructose, it's the carbohydrate converted most efficiently into glycerol 3-phosphate. And it's one of several reasons, my apologies for this slide, that fructose is considered the most lipogenic of carbohydrates. So that's an entirely different lecture about the role of sugar and high fructose corn syrup. So fructose is the carbohydrate converted most efficiently into glycerol 3-phosphate. And okay, that's what we just said. So now, you ask the question, that's sort of the baseline system. You've got fatty acids and triglycerides cycling in the fat tissue. As the triglycerides are broken down into fatty acids, they flow out into the bloodstream. And the question you want to ask is, what hormones control that? And the simple answer is, what hormones do is they tell our bodies to do something, and they also tell our bodies to release the energy available to do it. And every hormone basically works. Here's the breakdown of triglycerides into fatty acids. Every hormone basically works to increase the flow of fatty acids into the fat tissue, to make fuel available for the activities being promoted by the hormone. The only one that does the opposite is insulin. Insulin is the principal regulator of fat metabolism. That's been known since 1965, 5 years after Rosalind Yalow and Solomon Bersin developed the technology for actually measuring hormones in the blood cell. And the release of fatty acids from fat cells requires only the negative stimulus of insulin deficiency. So basically, if you want to get fat out of your fat tissue, you have to lower insulin levels. If insulin levels are high, all these other hormones that work to get fat out won't even do their job. The fundamental thing you have to do, this is how the American Medical Association put it in 1974, fat is mobilized from fat tissue when insulin secretion diminishes. And we know this. So basically what insulin does is it puts fat in fat tissue and it keeps it there. And we've known this in effect for 80 years. Type 1 diabetics, they don't produce insulin, so without insulin therapy, they'll die emaciated. Best and Heiss, Best is the best from Banting and Best that invented insulin. They put it this way. The fact that insulin increases the formation of fat has been obvious ever since the first emaciated dog or diabetic patient demonstrated a fine pad of adipose tissue made as a result of treatment with the hormone. Back in the 1930s, 1920s, after the discovery of insulin, the research used to use it to treat anorexics. Hugo Roney, a Northwestern University endocrinologist, in his textbook Obesity and Leanness, reported that patients gain as much as 6 pounds a week on insulin therapy if also fed meals, quote, rich in carbohydrates. Type 2 diabetics will gain fat when you give them insulin therapy. They'll get fatter. That's been shown in virtually every study, like the Accord study, which was published in the New England Journal of Medicine a year and a half ago. The patients gained on average, almost 10 pounds in the intensive therapy group compared to controls, and 28% gained more than 20 pounds. So how does it work? And this is from Jocelyn's diabetes mellitus. Well, weight gain can result from the direct lipogenic effect of insulin on adipose tissue independent of food intake. Insulin makes people fat. That's what it does. It's a lipogenic hormone, and you can see this example. This is from Endocrinology, an integrated approach. It's a 2000 textbook. It can be accessed on the NIH Library of Medicine website. The overall action of insulin on the adipocyte is to stimulate fat storage and inhibit mobilization. The remarkable effects of locally injected insulin and the accumulation of triglyceride into adipocytes, fat cells, are graphically illustrated here. And this is a patient who developed type 1 diabetes mellitus in 1941. She was 17. She injected herself daily over a period of some 47 years with 60 units bovine soluble insulin using only 2 injection sites on her thighs, and she ends up with these massive fat deposits. And the point is, they have nothing to do with how much she ate or how much she exercised. It's purely the effect of insulin. So the bottom line, when insulin is secreted, a chronically elevated fat accumulates in the fat tissue. When insulin levels drop, fat escapes from the fat tissue and the fat depots shrink. And we secrete insulin effectively in response to the carbohydrates in our diet. Okay, so whenever I get to this point, often in an audience, I see people think, oh my God, it's that Atkins crap. Like he fooled us. He backed us into that Atkins crap. And the fact is, it is that Atkins crap. And Atkins read the exact same research that I did 40 years ago and concluded from that research that carbohydrates literally make you fat, and fat and protein do not. And carbohydrates do this by stimulating insulin secretion. It's unfortunate, but it's true. And George Cahill, in 1965, the American Physiological Society published a 500-page textbook on fat metabolism. And George Cahill of Harvard was one of the co-editors. And this textbook basically said insulin makes you fat. I mean, there were 50 chapters, 50 different research groups publishing their results, and we secrete insulin. And when I was writing the book and I had this textbook, I bought a copy, I'm reading it, I called up Cahill, was still around, and I said, George, I don't get it. I hear you've had this revolution in the science of fat metabolism that started in 1956, the first time there were techniques to measure fatty acids in the bloodstream. And then in 1965, the American Physiological Society publishes this textbook, and the introduction says, we want to get this research from the journals out to the general public. And every single chapter is basically saying carbohydrates, as George said to me, carbohydrate is driving insulin, is driving fat. And if you remove this sentence, these 3 words, is driving insulin, you have the logically identical statement, carbohydrate is driving fat. And the funny thing is, George Cahill believes that a calorie is a calorie is a calorie, and that we get fat because we're sedentary. But if you can get yourself free of the overeating sedentary hypothesis, what you're left with is there's no hypothesis for why we go fat is because of the carbohydrates in the diet. I'm going to skip that slide. Here's a reasonable summary. In 1963, the Journal of the American Medical Association published a 12-page article on this research by Edgar Gordon, a physiologist at the University of Wisconsin. They discovered